Essa música.
Hello, I am Aisha.
And Paula, your cultural hybrid mental health therapist.
Here to explore unfiltered and heartfelt conversations on core issues
that affect us as human beings. Get ready for honest, captivating,
and real stories that take you on a journey to navigate your life
in the best possible way.
So grab a seat
and stay with us on this episode of
Do We Have Your Attention?
Welcome back to our podcast, everyone. You're here with your hosts, Paula and
Aisha.
And today we will be talking about a topic that hits home for many individuals, unresolved trauma.
Da, da, da.
The collective sigh and the collective Okay, so whether it's something that stems from childhood or past relationships or painful life experiences, trauma is absolutely something that sticks around with us and affects our developmental trajectory. So this is obviously a topic that I think a lot of us are going to be able to learn from. What would you say about that, Aisha? Are we all going to be able to learn
Paula.
from?
Absolutely. I think trauma isn't always about what's happened to us, but also about what we carry with us. And
Very
often
true.
for years, without even knowing that it's influencing our decisions, emotions, and our relationships.
Very
but
true.
Of course, before we get into the topic for today, we're going to start with our feelings check-in. So how are you feeling today, Paula?
Okay.
What a deep sigh.
It's a deep sigh because this is obviously a very serious conversation.
Yes.
It's also an exciting conversation too as well. I'm looking forward to having us really just dive in and have our listeners really understand what unresolved trauma is. But then I'm also a little nervous, if I'm being honest.
I can relate to the nervousness.
So I think I'm feeling a little bit of gray. But then also a little bit of yellow of being optimistic that it's going to be a good conversation.
Thank you for sharing.
How about you? How are you feeling?
I agree with you. I'm feeling great. Well, it's a very heavy topic. Trauma is heavy. And no matter how you want to put it, a very heavy topic. But I'm also very sad because I'm sick. So I'm just trying to make my chest or my throat get affected by disrupt recording of this topic. But I think we'll be fine. But I'm also very happy and I feel positive because at the end of the day, we do this to educate people. So I think that it would be a very educational topic for people to learn from. So I'm very excited about that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And of course, to our listeners too as well, we want you to take some time to check in with yourselves. How are you feeling today? It's always a good thing to be able to pause and just acknowledge what you're experiencing on the inside.
Agreed. And so today's episode will focus on understanding what happens when we don't address our traumas. And we'll be exploring the long-term effects, how it shows up in our lives, and most importantly, what we can do to start healing moving forward. So heavy. But there's light at the end of the tunnel.
I feel like the more we keep saying so heavy, we're going to literally chase people away. So light, so inviting, so great.
No, that's why I said so heavy, but there's light at the end of the tunnel. There's something to take out of this episode, okay? So stick around.
Absolutely.
Just wait. Just wait.
Absolutely. So obviously get comfortable. Join us on this deep dive of really being able to understand what happens when we have experiences of unresolved trauma.
Yes.
And to bring me to my first question, what exactly do we actually mean by unresolved trauma? If there's someone listening and actually going, what do you mean by unresolved trauma? What would you say? And of course, why do you think some people struggle with addressing their trauma?
Very, very great question. Great question. So unresolved trauma is the psychological wound from distressing events. So events that affected your social, emotional, physical, spiritual well-being that remains unprocessed or healed. And the fact that they are unresolved means that they continue to affect how you think, affects your emotions, affects your behaviors. and mostly in ways that we're unaware of. And of course, we've talked about trauma in an episode before, and we talk about how trauma can stem from various sources like your childhood neglect, abuse, violence, accidents, natural disasters, or any overwhelming situation that makes a person feel powerless. And people struggle with addressing their trauma because obviously these traumatic events can be very painful. And I think as human beings, nobody wants to sit with that painful feeling or just the memory of remembering how difficult that moment was for you. And people just naturally want to avoid this. And I think another thing is like people aren't really aware sometimes that they've experienced the trauma.
Yeah.
You'll be surprised by how people have normalized their trauma. Sometimes I talk to people and I'm like, that sounds like you experienced a trauma, and they just say like it was something that happened and they just moved on with their lives. And I think that's because people like to suppress, because again, those things are the memories of that is very painful, and they don't want to acknowledge it because that would bring them to a time where they felt powerless, like I was saying earlier. And people are also struggling with being vulnerable with stressful or like situational events that they've experienced. So it can be very hard to address unresolved trauma. But again, if you don't know, like you could truly tell by your behavioral patterns, like same things happening in your relationship, same things happening in the way you're experiencing life, or just the way you view the world, yourself and others. What do you think?
Absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head with that, which is very, very true. And a lot of times, I think when we hear unresolved, we see it as we are aware. And in some cases, we're actually not aware that we have trauma that is unresolved. But then when you think about the word unresolved trauma, it just means trauma that needs to be resolved, basically. So whether it means resolved by it being addressed, it being processed, it being acknowledged, that is really up to obviously whoever has experienced that is. But then in a lot of cases, it's just when our trauma, like the impact of trauma has not been fully addressed. Whereas in some other cases, we might be aware of it, but we are either avoidant of it, dismissive of it, or to some degree, we might even suppress. And I've met a lot of people who talk about compartmentalizing their trauma, and they speak about it so confidently and so good. Like, yes, I'm excellent at compartmentalizing. I'm so glad I pronounced that word because that word is one of my difficult words.
I'm not going to try and pronounce it.
I've met so many people who sort of talk about like, I just put it in a shelf and a cupboard, never to be found and never to be seen or addressed again. And they feel good about it. So to some degree, when we find ourselves in experiences that don't feel resolved, that typically can indicate what unresolved trauma is. And to answer the second question, or the two-part question, why do some people struggle with addressing their trauma? I think honestly, like the first thing is fear.
I mean, it's hard. It's very hard.
It is very scary. Like, let's be real. It's very scary, especially because we live in a world that does not really celebrate vulnerability, does not really celebrate transparency, does not really acknowledge you being honest with the experiences that you've had. And to a large degree, having worked through some of these unresolved experiences of trauma, can also be met with criticism
and judgment.
It can also be met with judgment, like you said too as well. It can also be met with the lack of the right type of support. So to a large degree, I've seen cases where people are actually perceived as victims. Like you're victimizing yourself because you're so open about your experiences of trauma. So, of course, if you think about it, that the reception to you actually being someone who might possibly be navigating their experiences of trauma in a way that's healthy is not really a positive reception, then the likelihood that you're going to feel good or willing or excited to want to resolve some of this trauma is probably very, very low.
I agree. And I think just to follow up on what you said, that lack of support or feeling like you don't have adequate resources can be a bigger part of it. Because a lot of things I hear with some of my clients is they have this cycle of always being vulnerable with, I won't say the wrong people, but it's always like the people that kind of validate that rejection, that judgmental part. Obviously, that's some unconscious work going on behind the scenes of just that self-fulfilling prophecy of nobody cares about me, or I'm not worthy of people listening to me. Just all those very unhealthy belief systems that develop from a traumatic event. But not having the right support or resources can be very, very...
It can be re-traumatizing.
It can re-traumatize you. Exactly. It just makes it harder to put yourself in a position to want to resolve the trauma. Like you said, people find it easier to box it on the side and be like, yeah, that thing happened, but it's like I'm seeing it in a third person view. Like, that happened to Aisha, but Aisha it's far away, that I've locked far away. Like it's going to take one key that I've buried in the ocean for you to open that version of Aisha, right? But it's like you're saying, the fear of being vulnerable, the fear of being re-traumatized is why people are doing that.
Yeah, just think about it too as well. The notion of I want to open up and I'm already feeling vulnerable about what I want to open up about. And then now I have to make sure that I'm opening up to the right person. It sounds, and I'm just saying, for the layman's perspective or the novice person, the everyday person's perspective, it sounds like work. It sounds as though you also have to almost have a level of vigilance in regards to how you share, how you open up to people. So, of course, I see why for a lot of people, they struggle with addressing their trauma.
Agreed. And just to kind of follow up with what we're talking about. So what ways do you think unresolved trauma can affect someone's mental health and emotional well-being? And how might it show up in their daily life? So 2 parts of this question.
Yeah. I think in regards to how it affects one's mental health and emotional well-being.
Yeah.
Honestly speaking, it's the first thing that comes to mind for me, obviously, being someone who actually is a trauma therapist and works a lot with complex PTSD clients. I see in a lot of cases where your everyday life starts to mimic your trauma environment.
Agreed.
So, and of course, that's literally PTSD, if you want to put it that way, where your everyday life mimics your trauma environment or your trauma environments, depending on obviously what experiences one has had, especially if it stems from childhood. So it's almost as though it's a relived experience of trauma that continuously keeps happening.
Wow.
Now, what that does to the brain, it does a lot. And of course, when I'm bringing up the brain, I'm also talking about, obviously, how that eventually impacts one's nervous system, subsequently impacting one's mental health, subsequently impacting one's emotional well-being too as well. And if I'm being honest, physical well-being. So I sort of describe it this way. If to some degree, let's say you've had exposure to, let's say, someone who's yelling. And I use this example because I had an experience where a kid of mine, when I said kid, it kind of sounded like it was my child.
Client. I was like, yeah, please verify.
Let me clarify. A former client of mine.
Not your child.
A former client of mine who happened to be a kid.
Yes.
This is a kid who had been exposed to a lot of domestic violence, yelling, arguments, fights between parents. Now, this kid, what ended up happening was someone in the office, I know this is so unethical, it's fine, because the therapist's office was yelling. Like there was someone screaming, yelling, and it was a loud noise and whatnot. So this kid had a very traumatic reaction, like a trauma response. Like the kid hid and like freaked out and panicked. And even I myself, I had the same similar response with the kid. And for some reason, in looking at it, I kind of saw like a child version of myself, an adult version of myself having the same reaction.
Same emotional reaction.
But then, of course, when I think about it, I'm saying that let's say if the kid was like 6, and now I'm about to be 30. And let's say that's when it happened. What I'm basically saying is, in a 30-year-old body, the 5-year-old's reaction is what, so to speak, is how I'm reacting in my everyday life. When there is something that doesn't necessarily pose a threat, but can be perceived as a threat. Now, if I'm saying that every constant experience, because there's loud noises like traffic, cars, fire trucks, ambulances, whatnot, just even people just yelling from excitement.
Yeah.
And I'm saying a great degree of the exposure of anything that sort of is perceived as a threat.
Right.
I'm reacting from a very fight or flight type of response. Like my nervous system is activated. I think it's a parasympathetic nervous system is activated. That easily in itself already affects and it can easily affect my mental health, my emotional well-being, my physical well-being.
Absolutely.
In what way?
Absolutely.
Maybe in a way where I start struggling with anxiety. Maybe in a way where I start struggling with a little bit of paranoia.
Yep.
Maybe in a way where I start struggling with distorted thinking. Maybe in a way where I start struggling from a perspective of, let's say, cognitive mind traps, because we've spoken about cognitive mind traps, right? Where we have distorted thinking patterns, jumping to conclusion, meaning we need to protect ourselves, something bad is happening or whatnot.
Right.
So to a large degree, unresolved trauma can honestly affect our quality of life and just even how we perceive life. So it's a very serious thing, if you put it that way.
I agree. And I love the example you gave of like seeing it's like 5-year-old you reacting in time just from like a sound that wasn't necessarily a threat. And just to emphasize what Paula said about your nervous system remains in a heightened state of alert. So fight or flight mode and making you, I guess, your sense of safety is jeopardized. You don't really know what's safe versus what's not safe. And that's what makes you react that way. But also, again, what you said about, you're going to become anxious all the time. Because imagine being alert by any sound that reminds you of your traumatic past, right?
Yeah.
You might become depressed, difficulty regulating your emotions because you might have a response to what 5-year-old you used to experience where you just hide and you're crying and you're just kind of folded up. But also, as you were talking, I was thinking about one of my clients who I just actually got on my caseload, whose response to trauma is now dissociating. Very sad. Like an extreme form of unresolved trauma response, just dissociating. Everything just seems unreal when they feel like they're exposed to stressful situations because of their childhood trauma of emotional neglect. And when their parents used to yell at them a lot, they used to feel like they're a failure. So if any of those feelings kind of start coming up for them in their adult body, they kind of just dissociate. And they'll tell me like, I have weeks of dissociating when I'm stressed out from school. And I was like, wow.
Yeah.
This is actually like a severe form of unresolved trauma presenting itself in your adult body.
Yeah, and if you think about it, just going off on what you're saying, you work with students. So there's it's in the student environment where they're supposed to obviously work towards a degree. Work towards being able to actually pass assessments, tests, examinations. And obviously they're young, they're living life, whatnot. Imagine having to navigate that on a daily basis and having the expectation of you having to also be able to actually pass your class to move to the next grade. The expectation to be able to read and to successfully be able to complete assessments and assignments and whatnot. It lets you see to a large degree just how much unresolved trauma and its impact on our brain and our emotional well-being and mental health and well-being. And I want to make this correction. It's the sympathetic nervous system. So that's a network of nerves that helps your body activate fight or flight response. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system is a part of the nervous system that actually helps you regulate. So more
your
of
emotions.
Rest. So it's sort of, they work opposites to each other. So when I'm saying the nervous system being activated consistently is the sympathetic nervous system. So imagine a student like this client of yours whose nervous system, a sympathetic nervous system is hyper activated, but then they still need to rest, sleep, study.
None of that is
pass
happening.
the examinations and then also maintain relationships too as well. Because it's not just about existing in life. It's also being able to maintain relationships and eventually subsequently maintain a job. You start to see just how much that impact has on us. And of course, the next thing that comes to mind for me is what some of these... Clearly, there's a lot of people that live life and are walking through life with coping mechanisms. Or let me put it this way, with unresolved trauma, rather.
Yes.
So to some degree, they've coped. And if you see me, I'm doing air quotes right now. They've coped.
Coped enough.
So when we're thinking about it from the perspective of, all right, so if people have managed to develop coping mechanisms that have helped them get as far as they have, despite having unresolved trauma. And if I'm being honest, I call it survival mechanisms. I would not call it coping mechanisms, because coping mechanisms are functional. Survival mechanisms are dysfunctional. But I will still ask the question, what would you say are some common survival mechanisms people develop when they don't actually address their trauma? And how do these mechanisms sometimes create more harm than good?
Very good question. I think the first one that comes to mind is avoidance. And avoidance is very common. So like avoiding situations, people, places that remind the person of the trauma. And it could also be like smell, part of your senses, because sometimes these traumatic events, you may not necessarily remember the person, or there might not be key things like physical things, but something as small as your scent may be able to remind you. So sometimes people react to smell in a very, very heightened, your sympathetic nervous system gets very heightened. And avoidance may also look like suppressing your thoughts or memories related to the event, distract yourself with work. And like Paula was saying earlier, compartmentalizing. I don't think I said it right.
Compartmentalizing.
Compartmentalizing. Anyway, you know what I mean. Putting it in one box just to suppress it enough. Just putting it there. It's like, I know we exist, but, as long as I can stay far away from my actual conscious functioning, then, I don't want to really worry about it. And that causes harm because it prevents a person from healing, because you don't really process or integrate that trauma. When I say integrate, I mean acknowledging, processing into your current life experiences in the way that you can move forward with the trauma. I think a big mistake people make is that they want to kind of wipe the traumatic memory away. A lot of my clients just don't want to think about it. They want to act like it didn't exist. And I'm like, that's impossible. You kind of have to work with it in a way that you form a story where you can move forward with it now, where it's not controlling you anymore. You kind of create your own narrative of that traumatic event. And avoidance can lead to isolation, anxiety, anhedonia, just basically like you're not really enjoying things that you would usually enjoy. But also avoidance kind of sometimes brings the traumatic memories, make them stronger, like, when you're trying hard to forget something, but it's just like hitting you at on your forehead, like, remember me. So like we're saying, they're temporary survival mechanisms, but they're not long-term. Another common way that people try to cope is substance use. Very, very common. So we all know that people drink and use other drugs or just other substances to numb their emotional pain or just to escape, like just get that temporary escape. But we also know that long-term use of substance use can lead to addiction. It can affect your physical health. It can cause problems in your relationship, and it can also worsen your mental health because it creates this cycle of dependence where you rely on these substances to help you cope. But the reality is you would always need something stronger. So last time I had 2 beers or 2 drinks. Okay, that worked for last time, but now I need 3. Now I need 4. Oh, it was alcohol. Oh, now I need something stronger, right? It's just kind of, you will always need something else to help you escape these memories. Another common one, and then I'll give you the floor to share some that you've seen in your work, is shutting down emotionally. So people are like, I'm emotionally numb.
Yeah, very common.
I don't want to feel this pain associated with the trauma. But the issue with numbing emotions is that you may suppress all your emotions. So you're not only numbing or suppressing the pain, you're also numbing and suppressing the emotions like happiness, joy, pride, like those good ones that come, those positive emotions that we are supposed to experience with life. And this emotional numbing creates a barrier to forming deep, meaningful relationships. And at the end of the day, you start feeling like people don't get you, they don't connect with you. That would also lead you to start isolating. And you just start feeling a sense of emptiness. And you just don't experience not normal, emotions related to like joy, happiness, love, connection, because you've just numbed every aspect of your emotions. So those are some of the common ones that I've seen. What about you?
Absolutely. Like you really hit the nail on the head. And as I was even listening to you two as well, I was really trying to even understand, like, if you were to explain this, what are the differences between coping mechanism versus survival/defense mechanism? Now, this terminologies, the cool thing here is the terminologies really explain a lot. Coping mechanism, so to cope. to
Right.
manage, right? And sometimes managing is not a negative thing. I manage anxiety versus I'm sort of not managing
Ignoring
anxiety
it.
or ignoring
Right.
it, right? Like you said, ignoring or avoiding or whatnot.
Yeah.
Versus, let's say, things like defense mechanisms. So already defense, that means you are preparing yourself for battle.
To fight.
You're preparing yourself for battle. You don't even know if there's
Right.
a battle, but you're already preparing yourself.
Right.
There's survival, meaning to some degree you're already fight or flight, which is very in line with defense in the sense where we're on edge, like we're ready.
Yeah.
So typically when we put it that way, we are hyper vigilant. We are
right.
hyper aware. We are hyper reactive. We are hyper sensitive.
Yeah.
And we're not necessarily vigilant because that's very okay. Now,
Yeah.
vigilant is coping mechanism.
Right.
Awareness is coping mechanism in that sense. Reactive, meaning being able to respond to actual situations that are threats, not perceived threats. To some degree, it's coping mechanism.
Right.
When we add the hyper aspect of it, it becomes more survival, defense, and of course that's where we start to see the actual difference. And I even quickly Googled, and you know this AI Google thing that's not out there where you Google and the AI is like, I'm gonna give you the answer now. So I'm going to be reading from AI's Google definition. Coping mechanisms are conscious strategies to manage stress and challenges, while defense mechanisms are unconscious responses to protect against emotional distress. So conscious strategy to manage
versus
unconscious response, not unconscious strategy, because how can it be a strategy if it's unconscious?
If it's unconscious, exactly.
Unconscious response to protect against emotional distress. So when you sort of look at it from that perspective, of course, defense mechanisms and survival mechanisms are going to cause more harm than good. It would appear.
Yeah, because they
as
think
though
they're protecting you.
It would appear maybe from a perspective of being in denial, a perspective of projection, a perspective of dissociation, like you mentioned with your client, a perspective of displacement, redirecting your negative emotions from one person to
that
another.
was common.
A perspective of repressing, which is very common too as well. It may appear that way. But the thing about defense mechanisms and survival mechanisms is they are temporary. Meaning they're not temporary. They're not built to last. They're not built to be sustainable because they're not conscious. And typically, if you think about it, typically when we have awareness and intention around certain things, we are looking at the bigger picture. Whereas if we're having sort of unconscious reactions and whatnot, we're not looking at the bigger picture to some degree. So I think to a large extent, sometimes that's where we get very, very confused. Because we see these things as things that protect us, but then it puts us in a position where we start to realize that like, okay, maybe we need to start being a lot more aware of what is being helpful, what is being functional, what is being dysfunctional, basically.
I agree. And I am so glad that you broke it down that way so that people can be aware of what some of these survival defense mechanisms can look like versus coping. Like you said, coping mechanisms, you look at the bigger picture, right? Survival and defense, you're just reacting to what your body thinks is threat. Because when we experience some of these traumatic events, your brain kind of categorizes them as, okay, this is threat, so how do we react? How do we react, right? And in the moment, it's going to do what it thinks is beneficial for you. But like Paula was saying, these reactions are temporary one, and most times they're not healthy, right? They just make you feel comfortable in the moment. But the discomfort of looking at the bigger picture and actually processing healing, that's going to take looking at the bigger picture and creating healthier coping mechanisms.
Absolutely.
Thank you for breaking that down.
You're very welcome.
So just to follow up what we're discussing, I wonder what the first thing someone should do if they suspect that they're dealing with unresolved issues. And most specifically, I think talking about offering support to friends or family members who might be dealing with unresolved trauma without overstepping boundaries. Because something that I've seen there's this, I don't know, people always, like, once people can tell that someone's dealing with unresolved trauma or like depression or anxiety or like just mental health issues, I kind of notice that people want to back away. They either want to back away or they want to give advice straight up. And I know that's because you obviously care about this person. You want to help them by giving them advice, or you may just feel like, oh, it's too heavy. I don't want to have to deal with it. So I think this is actually great for us to talk about.
Yes, I appreciate you sharing that. And it's very true. What you said about the heaviness is real. I don't know if you're watching the most recent season of Love is Blind.
Girl, I don't watch that show. I don't know why.
You don't? Okay. Well, if you want to start, do not start with this season. Unless if you're looking at it from a therapist perspective, then I think it's great.
For research
There's a
purposes.
lot of unresolved trauma. Like, it is amazing that the premise of the show is people dating through a wall to see if love is blind based off connection and conversation and not necessarily surface things like looks. Now, a lot of people found connection through trauma bonding.
Oh, God.
On this season I'm watching, a lot of people also found connection through something that was considered as, let's say, oversharing, for example, as a result of unresolved trauma, but seeing that as like, oh, wow, they're being open, they're being vulnerable. Let me connect with them. There's a guy on the show who unfortunately has suffered a lot of grief, like a lot.
Oh, no.
And his grief was what was used to some degree unintentionally to connect with the woman that he was talking to. So for her, it was like, wow. He's being so open and so vulnerable. But then when we started to see their interaction and the more they got to get to know one another, we started to see there is a lot of unresolved grief and a lot of unresolved trauma. Now, the discourse on social media is, this guy is just too heavy. Everything is just trauma, grief. And to some degree, of course, that was immediate. That's shunned. It's not seen as, wow. Some people were like, oh God, he just needs therapy. Like, he needs to go get healed or something.
He needs to go get help.
Now, I'm even part of people that was just like, oh my Lord. As I was watching it and just going and talking to my friend, I'm like, can we maybe have something else? But now, of course, when we're seeing something like this coming from a place of someone who actually knows this person, because these are all human beings who have real life experiences. And to some degree, we can all give our opinions, but there's people who love these people. There's people who support these people. These are also real life things that they've gone through.
Yeah, agreed.
And you start to see, as someone who obviously might have a friend who's going through something very similar, you start realizing that you can absolutely give support. You can absolutely give feedback. From a place of love, concern, curiosity, but not judgment, not criticism. But how do you actually see when there might be like a call to action for you to maybe play some type of role? If you know people who have avoidant behaviors, if you know people who often, let's say, misuse substances, people who struggle with emotional vulnerability, who are often very distant, people who seem very hypervigilant, people who maybe share with you intrusive thoughts that they have, and you're like, I don't know if you should be thinking, like, I don't know if this is healthy, but not from a place of judgment, but more so seeing a collective of some of these behaviors. Now, if you see people who might have trust issues, but very extensive type of trust issues, people who might be dissociative too as well, people who self-harm, people who seem to have poor interpersonal relationships. It's hard for them to keep a job.
Just going Paula.
Healthy relationships. People who might have poor self-esteem, obviously that's a very big one as well. Even outbursts, a lot of emotional dysregulation. So basically what we're just saying is there's a lot less functionality in their behaviors and a lot more dysfunction in their behaviors, where you might then go, okay, I'm noticing these things. I don't know if you're noticing them. What do you think? Do you think this might be worth addressing? It might be worth seeking help and getting the right kind of help. But coming from a place of, I keep saying, concern, love, respect, but then curiosity is asking more questions, but then being able to encourage them to guide their own selves to figuring out what it is that they actually need. I think to a large degree, that's kind of the approach that we need to take when we may suspect that people might be dealing with unresolved trauma. And before you go policing anybody's behavior, all these things I just said and all this list of signs that I just said, but then also all of the approaches to as well. Start that with yourself first. Ask yourself these questions. Are these some of the things that I do? Because 9 out of 10, no, let me say fine, 7 out of 10 to be on the safe side, 7 out of 10, you most likely are going to meet some level of criteria here that might also let you know to a large degree that we need to be shining the mirror on ourselves a lot more than we shine it on other people as well.
Right. Agreed. I absolutely agree. And I think just to emphasize what Paula said about being curious, but approaching it with love, care, support, and just like an observation. Don't go in there attacking the person. And I think usually people use that approach of blaming the person and, you know, focusing on negative behaviors or like, you always do this, you always do that. And obviously people are going to be defensive to that approach. They're not going to take in what you're telling them. They're not going to be able to reflect a little bit and be like, you know what, you're right.
Yeah.
So kind of going in with care and support and, as Paula said, curiosity, but also like be mindful of your limits. You're not people's therapist. So if you're not a professional, don't go there trying to be a professional because you will burn out very fast.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, like Paula was saying, if you've not done your own work, it might actually re-traumatize you. So don't put yourself in a situation. No, but it's true.
No, it's just why I'm laughing is because I don't know if you know those people. Well, not category generalize, but people who they haven't done their own work, but they'll be like, Aisha, I'm just noticing that you have trust issues. Aisha, I don't know. It seems like you have low self-esteem.
Aisha.
Thank you. Everything's just like, Aisha.
Yes.
Aisha.
So that's this is a good example because this is not what we want. We don't want you to use that approach. Please know your limits, but also you can't help someone if you've not helped yourself, right?
Yeah,
so if you've not done your own work or if you're not doing your own work well enough to be able to identify what you're observing in the other person, then please don't open a jar that it will now be too difficult to close back again. So just wanted to put that out there real quick.
Absolutely. And it brings me to my last question. And this is a very great question. What does healing from trauma look like in real life? Does it mean, and I know you already hinted on this already, or touched on this. Does it mean forgetting or simply learning how to live with it more healthily?
Yeah, absolutely. I think healing is about learning to live with it and not forgetting.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is you learn, like I was saying earlier, to move forward with this very, very painful experience and putting it into your life in a way that it doesn't dominate or control every aspect of it. Now you get to create your own narrative. Now you get to create your own story and move forward with it. You're still going to have memories of this trauma because we're human beings. And as long as our brain is functioning, those things are still going to exist. But over time, these memories will no longer define your day-to-day interactions, your day-to-day experiences. Over time, as you develop healthier ways to cope, not those survival or defense mechanisms, you get to learn to cope with them in a way that makes sense for you now and in a way that it doesn't really control you anymore. And we can't forget trauma, like I said, because that's not how our brain works, right? So that's why processing trauma, and that's why it's good when we try to resolve it in a way by making sense of it and making it part of our stories in a way that we can move forward from it. And then you get to have like a new perspective. You get to grow. You get to be inspired onto like new paths. You get to be an advocate for yourself, but even advocate for other people, right? So it can be very empowering when you work with this trauma and like process it and try to integrate it into your daily life now. But it also looks like forgiveness and self-compassion for yourself. It's not an easy process and it takes time. I think one of the difficult things working with clients that present with trauma is they just kind of, yes, they understand, I want to move forward. It was like, when do we get there? Like, it's been 2 weeks now. And I'm like, girl, it's just 2 weeks. We're just getting started.
Do you know what I'm saying doing now for my clients? Because what you just said is so true. It's actually so common, especially in trauma therapy work. I already just give them, I'm like, you know how you have like a menu and you have like a taster? You get an idea of what to expect. So I'm already, before they would say it, I'm like, let me just let you know. This is not immediate gratification, immediate answer. This is none of that. This is a journey and this is a lifelong journey. So if you're still apprehensive, you can still try. But if you're not ready, then maybe to some degree you need to allow yourself get to a point where you are ready because that need for now is deep.
Girl, I know. Everyone wants immediate gratification, but that's just not how it works with healing. It takes time. You're going to have high moments. You're going to have low moments. You're going to have moments where you're like, I got this. Yeah, this was not even as bad as I thought it would be. Yeah. But again, that's all part of the process. And you have to give yourself that self-compassion and empathy to recognize that it's not an easy process. But as long as you're starting and you've put yourself in a position where you want to learn and integrate this trauma into creating a new story for yourself, then
absolutely.
You've done the
and
work.
I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I think that we did an excellent job, not to toot our own horns, but I am. We did an excellent job in just really being able to break down what happens when we experience unresolved trauma. And to sort of wrap up the conversation, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine earlier on about the topic that we're going to discuss. And he said something I felt was very, very profound. And I was like, I'm going to write this down because I have to reference this to some degree. And he said, only a person, and I'll just paraphrase what he said, only a person who is actively healing can see the world for what it is and navigate it in the healthiest way possible for them.
What a wise friend. That's a very good way of reframing.
We'll take that in the sense where this is why, obviously, when to answer that last question of what does healing from trauma actually look like in real life, it allows you actually see the world the way it is and for what it is and navigate it in the healthiest way possible for yourself. But the only type of person that's able to do so is someone that is actively healing themselves.
Wow, what a way to wrap up. Thank you for that gem. I will take that and start using it for my clients too.
You move it every time I hear my friends say something. Okay, take no right. And it's funny because we all do it.
That sounds powerful. That sounds like it would be beneficial for someone in my session to hear.
Absolutely. And I just want to thank you for joining me.
As
and
always.
Thank me for joining you.
Thank you for joining me. Thank myself for joining you.
This was a good conversation, but something so heavy. I think we were able to navigate it in a way where our listeners are going to be prompted to really think.
Right.
And of course, to keep the conversation going, how can our listeners find us so that way we can hear questions, feedback, thoughts, feelings about a topic that is so dear and near to us?
Okay, so you could find us on Instagram or X, formerly known as Twitter, at DWHYA Podcast. I'm sorry, I always have to add that because everyone just knows it as Twitter. You could email us at info@DWHYApodcast.com. You could also find us on TikTok at DWHYA Podcast 1. And we do want to hear from you, so reach out. Share your thoughts, feelings, anything you're thinking, we would like to know, like Paula said. So, And on that note, see you in the next episode.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.